Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Aniekwa. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, a major legislative victory for President Joe Biden in the United States. His massive coronavirus relief package, worth almost $2 trillion, has cleared its final hurdle in Congress. But it was approved by the House of Representatives without a single Republican vote in favor. So no bipartisan comfort at all for Joe Biden here. We'll discuss this with my first guest today, the former U.S. Congressman Albert Wynn, who is a Democrat and a strong supporter of Joe Biden. And later, as Syria marks a decade of war this week, the UN says its people continue to suffer unimaginable violence and repression. But in the pandemic, the country has fallen off the front page. And now 35 aid organizations have given a stark warning that Syria faces irreversible damage if a political solution to the country's crisis isn't found. We'll speak to a representative in the Middle East of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Coming up. Now, President Biden's massive coronavirus relief package has cleared its final hurdle in the U.S. Congress. Worth $1.9 trillion, it was approved by the House of Representatives without a single Republican vote in favor. Democrats say the bill is historic and transformative, but Republicans say it includes measures that are unrelated to COVID relief and unfairly benefit states run by Democrats. The top Republican in the House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy, said it was not a relief bill, but a payoff, and what he called a laundry list of left-wing priorities that predates the pandemic.
So let's be clear. This isn't a rescue bill. It isn't a relief bill. It's a laundry list of left-wing priorities that predate the pandemic and do not meet the needs of the American families.
It includes the refundable tax credit, which will lift 50% of children out of poverty. How do you say no to lifting 50% of impoverished children in America out of poverty? The Biden American Rescue Plan is about the children, their health, their education, the economic security of their families again. Our children's health is greatly protected by crushing the virus and by expanding access to health care through the Affordable Care Act expansions in here, Medicaid through FMAP, and in other ways as well. Our children's education is advanced with a $170 billion to open schools safely.
The Democrat Nancy Pelosi, and before her, the Republican Kevin McCarthy. Well, my first guest today is the former Congressman Albert Wynn, who served as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for 16 years. He's a Democrat and a strong supporter of President Joe Biden, and he joins me now from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We appreciate your presence and we appreciate your analysis. A lot of people excited that finally the $1.9 trillion relief package that President Biden promised has now passed. I mean, that's an enormous amount of money.
It is. Well, first, thank you for having me this morning. It is an enormous package. It is the largest package that we have seen, certainly in my lifetime. It is comparable to the New Deal that pulled America out of the Great Depression nearly 100 years ago. This is game-changing. It is dramatic. I don't think you can overemphasize the importance of what this bill does. It definitely addresses the problems from the pandemic in terms of vaccines, opening schools, direct aid to families. Tremendously important. I was really pleased with what Ms. Pelosi pointed out, and that is the work that we are doing to help children and lift them out of poverty. A country as great as America should not have to deal with a high level of poverty among its children. This bill addresses it I think it's a complete success.
Well, I mean, we're going to drill down a bit with your help into the sort of the main elements of that bill, but some people call it a stimulus bill, but in a way it's more of a relief bill, isn't it? It's help, it's not trying to stimulate the economy, it's actually trying to rescue it.
I think that's a good characterization. Rescuing the economy means putting money back into people's pockets so they can go out and spend it, so that restaurants can reopen, so that the hospitality industry can reopen, so that so many people can go back to work. I think it is an absolutely essential element of what we're trying to do here, and that is putting money directly into people's pockets. But it also contains money to open schools, which helps people go back to work because they don't have to teach their kids at home. So all of these components work hand in hand. Getting kids back to school, putting money into people's pockets, all those are absolutely essential elements. There's some other things in this bill, though, that I think are good and I think are part of rescue. There's $4 billion in debt release for African-American farmers. African-American farmers have suffered historic discrimination in this country. This bill is a first step toward addressing that. There's money for rural broadband, again, addressing needs of people to have access to broadband, to in turn work in schools and businesses, to promote retail. So it does a lot of things to get America back on its feet, whether you call it rescue or whether you call it relief. It is an infusion of money back into an economy that has been tragically shut down.
Well, the point you're making is actually supported by a lot of Americans, but from what I understand, the US has upped its national debt by more than 30% in the last year alone. How alarming is that? I mean, somebody said it was racing to the cliff edge and a drop-off like Wile E. Coyote.
Well, that's an interesting and somewhat amusing analogy, but I don't think it's accurate. Yes, we are increasing the deficit. That unfortunately is necessary in this circumstance. But this infusion of capital has a stimulative effect that I think is very helpful. I think if we get the economy back on track, we can address any deficit problems down the road. But all the major economists have pointed out that you need this stimulus. You're showing a picture of empty restaurants. That says it all. We have to get the economy back on track first, then we can deal with any inflationary concerns.
Congressman Wynn, are there things in that bill that you think perhaps should not have been priorities right now, or do you think this was a reasonable response to the economic crunch that America faces right now?
I think that's a key question. I do think it's a reasonable response, and I'll tell you why. Right now, Republicans have been tremendously obstructionist. They've not been willing to compromise or cooperate. Had they come in and said, well, we'll support 1.2 billion or 1.3 billion, I think we could have reached a compromise. Instead, they came in with a very small amount, 600 billion, that just is totally inadequate. And so I think it reflects the fact that in the absence of cooperation from the Republicans, Democrats are going to have to utilize this reconciliation approach and get as much passed as they possibly can using this vehicle. It's unfortunate that it has reached this point, but that's the reality. Republicans are not willing to cooperate, therefore Democrats have to use reconciliation, and in that process they have to try to include as many of their priorities as possible. You'll recall former President Trump did the same thing when he wanted to provide tax benefits for very wealthy Americans and corporations. He used the same mechanism and it benefited the upper income echelon of American society. Democrats are saying we want to deal with regular working class Americans and we want to provide the kind of relief they need, lift people out of poverty, help African American farmers, help cities get back on their feet, because the cities have taken a tremendous hit as a result of the economic shutdown. So all of the things in that bill make sense. They aid in the stimulating the economy. And I think that this provides us with perhaps the only opportunity to do that at this time.
Well, I mean, I get the point that you're making, Congressman Wynn. Nevertheless, President Biden had promised a bipartisan approach, but not a single Republican supported the bill in either chamber. And so Democrats, as you said, had to use a measure that bypassed them in order to get it through the Congress. I mean, not the most auspicious unifying start for Mr. Biden, is it?
Well, it's unfortunate we weren't able to reach a bipartisan resolution of this because I'm a big proponent of bipartisanship. However, the most important thing, we're talking hard politics now, the most important thing for Democrats is to get it done, which is to say they have to put money in people's pockets, they have to get this economy going, and they have to show the American people that politics and government can work. And the way that occurs is when the private sector reopens, the schools reopen, businesses reopen, people have money to spend. That's the American economy. If you don't address that, the next election, the public's going to say, well, you didn't deliver, you didn't improve our quality of life, and therefore the Democrats would be out of business. So this is the fulfillment of a Democratic commitment to the American people, and I think that this is a signature success that will last for years, perhaps even decades. If you recall, the New Deal, which brought us out of the Great Depression, was lauded for years as a signature government accomplishment. This is another signature government accomplishment.
Well, Congressman Wynn, I know you're not a spokesman for the Republicans, but I mean, it seems a bit odd that there is so much public support for this bill, and in some cases 40-odd%, even 60% of Republicans supporting it, but then no Republicans at all supported it in Congress. Is that because they have a specifically political agenda? They don't want to give Joe Biden any bipartisan comfort at all?
Well, I think that's true. Traditionally, after a presidential election, the next election for Congress, the opposition party is very successful by pointing out all the failures of the new administration. They're not going to be able to do that in this case because the Democratic Party will have been very successful in fulfilling its campaign promises. I quite frankly think the Republican elected officials are misreading this issue. The American people, as you point out, both Democrat and Republican, support this approach. Let's face it. Everybody wants money. Nobody's going to turn down or turn their nose up at the prospect of additional revenue. A lot of the Republican base, basically working class Americans in the Midwest, the South, and other parts of the country, they're going to benefit as much as anyone else because they need the direct payments, they need the child support, and they want this. So I think what you will likely see is a significant shift as more Republicans among the American public, that is to say, shift toward the Democratic Party. And that's what happened after the New Deal. That's what I think you're going to see here.
Okay, Congressman Wynn, please stay with us. We'd like to talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our analysis of President Biden's massive COVID relief package, which has cleared its final hurdle in the US Congress. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. So a major legislative victory for President Joe Biden in the United States. He passed his $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief bill. The measures contained in the package are aimed at kickstarting the economy, which has been stalled by the pandemic. Mr. Biden said that it gives U.S. workers a fighting chance. They're all going to get a one-off payment of $1,400. Well, most citizens at least. Another key provision is an expansion of the child tax credit, which means that more than half of the 27 million children in America will be lifted out of poverty. And the former Congressman, Albert Wynn, who served as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for 16 years and is a Democrat and strong supporter of Joe Biden, is still with me from Washington. Thank you very much indeed, Congressman Wynn, for staying with us. And of course, in the U.S., there is an official poverty measure, isn't there? And there's another measure, I think, called the supplemental poverty measure, which takes into account government programs. When you look at that measure against this COVID stimulus package, does it support the initial estimate, which suggests that child poverty will be cut in half?
I think it does. The poverty rate in America is a real tragedy, a disgrace, and an embarrassment to what America stands for. The level of food insecurity, for example, is another area where we see poverty rearing its ugly head. The fact that a lot of children in America don't have access to the kind of technology that enables them to learn remotely or keep pace with new developments in education and technology, that lack of access is really problematic. This bill addresses some of that. And for America to be the country that it can be, we have to lift, as we say, all boats. This is an opportunity to do that. This reflects the difference between the Democratic philosophy and the Republican approach, which quite frankly right now is a little short on new ideas about how to improve the quality of life, because ultimately that's the purpose of government, to improve the quality of life of its citizens. This bill addresses that.
As I understand it, most of that is being driven by the expanded child tax credit, which historically was a usual tax benefit that you get at the end of the year when you file your tax returns. But it's now being converted into a sort of child allowance monthly benefit. Is that right?
That is correct, and I think that's very important. When we come out of this pandemic, we're going to be looking at a new world of work, a new world of technology. And one of the things we have to do is take care of our young people, and in turn, take care of our families who have to raise these young people. And the way you do that is providing this benefit. There's tremendous pressure on working class families, and childcare costs are one of the major considerations, one of the major factors. It drives poverty, it inhibits growth, it inhibits the ability of parents to improve their lives through higher education and the like. So when you provide this benefit directly to parents, you're number one, putting money in their pockets for the essentials, the school books, the clothes, the food, and that sort of thing. But you're also removing pressure on parents that will allow them to raise their children with some of the other things that the middle class enjoys: the occasional trip, maybe a vacation, educational tools, those kind of things that poor children often don't get because their parents are basically working on a hand-to-mouth basis. So this is a fundamental and philosophical change in terms of what America is going to look like. Joe Biden and Democrats are saying, we're going to take care of children. We're going to enable young families with children to prosper and grow. And we're not going to just focus on the large corporations and corporate tax breaks and a trickle-down economic theory. We're going to look at a more public-oriented, humanistic approach that takes care of children. That's the kind of society we all aspire to. And you can't do it if you have so many parents struggling and so many children below the poverty level.
And in terms of lifting so many people out of poverty, I mean, you talked pointedly about that. It's been said that in particular, Black, Hispanic, and indigenous Americans stand to benefit. I mean, why does it seem to be racially polarizing and an issue affecting mostly minority communities?
That is unfortunately the sad reality in America, that because of racism and discrimination on a historical and systemic basis, those groups that you cited, African Americans, Hispanics, indigenous communities, are underserved. They have been discriminated. They have not had the economic opportunities. They have not had the educational opportunities. And as a result, they're disproportionately represented among the poor. And so obviously, those of us from the African American community and other minority communities are saying it's time to change that. The Democratic Party, when you talk about the party base, this is one element of the base. This is what Joe Biden talked about. This is the group of people he campaigned to. This is a group of people who helped get him elected. And he's fulfilling a commitment to lift those folks out of poverty. I mentioned earlier aid for Black farmers. No one's ever talked about that before. But for years, white farmers were getting loans and grants and support, and Black farmers were being systematically, similarly situated African American farmers were being systematically denied access to these federal resources. So it's time to address that. So when you look at that, you look at economic issues and employment opportunities and educational opportunities, there is indeed a gap. That gap's reflected in broadband access to other technologies. And so in order to address that, the Democratic underlying philosophy is we're going to have to make sure that we have aid that is targeted to those groups, as opposed to the traditional approaches that have been used, which is kind of a top-down, well, let's help the corporations and they'll create jobs and that'll aid everyone. That works to an extent, but it hasn't addressed the fundamental disparities of institutional racism caused by institutional racism, and that's what we've really got to get at.
The problem, of course, is that obviously this measure is now going to create a predictable income stream for the families concerned. So my question is, how permanent is it? Or is it more of a temporary fix that can be overturned? I understand they're going to be looking at it again and possibly voting and debating it again in a year.
You have zeroed in on one of the key issues, but I will tell you this, and it is almost an axiom of politics: benefits, once provided, are very hard to eliminate. Politically, it is not going to be very tenable, even for Republicans, once people have this money in their pocket, once they receive the child care benefit, to remove it, to vote it out. That's not going to happen, I don't think. I mean, it's like any other tax. I mean, it could be a small business tax break. It could be a big business tax break. Once you give a governmental benefit, it is incredibly hard from a political standpoint to remove that benefit or take that benefit back.
Congressman Wynn, we've got less than a minute before we have to end the chat, but I'm just listening to you and your really good, incisive analysis there and the animation in your voice when you talk about it. I mean, you were in Congress for 16 years. I wonder if you miss being there.
Actually, I do not, because of the partisanship that exists now. The animation you hear in my voice is the excitement, because this is what government is supposed to do: change the lives of people. I love seeing this level of commitment to addressing America's problems. We have not done it. It's unfortunate it took a pandemic and a parliamentary maneuver to get this through on a partisan basis, but it works. It puts money in people's pockets. I'm delighted.
Congressman Albert Wynn, I want to thank you very much indeed for being with us. And he was talking to me there from Washington. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including as Syria marks a decade of war this week. Aid agencies have given a stark warning that the country faces irreversible damage. Stay with us.